C.G. Jung, Dreams, Chapter 2, Dreams and Psychic Energy. General aspects of dream psychology. Dreams have a psychic structure which is unlike that of other contents of consciousness because, so far as we can judge from their form and meaning, they do not show the continuity of development typical of conscious content. They do not appear, as a rule, to be integral components of our conscious psychic life, but seem rather to be extraneous, apparently accidental occurrences. The reason for this exceptional position of dreams lies in their peculiar mode of origin. They do not arise, like other conscious content, from any clearly discernible logical and emotional continuity of experience, but are remnants of a peculiar psychic activity taking place during sleep. Their mode of origin is sufficient in itself to isolate dreams from other contents of consciousness, and this is still further increased by the content of the dreams themselves, which contrast strikingly with our conscious thinking. An attentive observer, however, will have no difficulty in discovering that dreams are not entirely cut off from the continuity of consciousness, for in almost every dream certain details can be found which have their origin in the impressions, thoughts, and moods of the preceding day or days. To that extent, a certain continuity does exist, though at first sight it points backwards. But anyone sufficiently interested in the dream cannot have failed to observe that dreams also have a continuity forwards, if such an expression be permitted, since dreams occasionally exert a remarkable influence on conscious mental life, even of persons who cannot be considered superstitious or particularly abnormal. These after effects consist mostly in more or less distinct alterations of mood. It is probably in consequence of this loose connection with the other contents of consciousness that the recollected dream is so extremely unstable. Many dreams baffle all attempts at reproduction, even immediately after waking. Others can be remembered only with doubtful accuracy, and comparatively few can be really distinct and clearly reproducible. This peculiar behavior may be explained by considering the characteristics of the various elements combined in a dream. The combination of ideas in dreams is essentially fantastic. They are linked together in a sequence which is, as a rule, quite foreign to our reality thinking, and in striking contrast to the logical sequence of ideas which we consider to be a special characteristic of conscious mental processes. It is to this characteristic that dreams owe the vulgar epithet meaningless. But before pronouncing this verdict, we should remember that the dreams and its content is something that we do not understand. With such a verdict, therefore, we would merely be projecting our own lack of understanding upon the object, but that would not prevent dreams from having an inherent meaning of their own. Apart from the efforts that have been made for centuries to extract a prophetic meaning from dreams, Freud's discoveries are the first successful attempt in practice to find their real significance. His work merits the term scientific because he has evolved a technique which not only he but many other investigators assert archives its objects, namely the understanding of the meaning of the dream. This meaning is not identical with the fragmentary meanings suggested by the manifest dream content. This is not the place for critical discussion of Freud's psychology of dreams. I shall try rather to give a brief summary of what may be regarded as the more or less established facts of dream psychology today. The first question we must discuss is, what is our justification for attributing to dreams any other significance than the unsatisfying fragmentary meaning suggested by the manifest dream content? One especially cogent answer in this respect is the fact that Freud discovered the hidden meaning of dreams empirically and not deductively. A further argument in favor of a possible hidden meaning is obtained by comparing dream fantasies with other fantasies of the waking state in one and the same individual. It is not difficult to see that waking fantasies have not merely a superficial concretistic meaning, but also a deeper psychological meaning. This is a very old and widespread type of fantastic story. There is a very old and widespread type of fantastic story, which Aesop's fables are typical examples, that provide a very good illustration of what may be said about the meaning of fantasies in general. For instance, a fantastic tale is told about the doings of a lion and an ass. Taken superficially and concretely, the tale is an impossible phantasm, but the hidden moral meaning is obvious to anyone who reflects upon it. It is characteristic that children are pleased and satisfied with the exoteric meaning of the fable. But by far the best argument for the existence of a hidden meaning in dreams is obtained by conscientiously applying the technical procedure for breaking down the manifest dream content. This brings us to our second main point, the question of analytic procedure. Here again, I desire neither to defend nor criticize Freud's views and discoveries, but shall confine myself to what seem to me firmly established facts. If we start from the fact that a dream is a psychic product, we have not the least reason to suppose that its constitution and function obey laws and purposes other than those applicable to any other psychic product. In accordance with a maxim, principles are not to be multiplied beyond the necessary. We have to treat the dream analytically, just like any other psychic product, until experience teaches us a better way. We know that every psychic structure, regarded from the casual standpoint, is the result of antecedent psychic contents. We know furthermore that every psychic structure, regarded from the final standpoint, has its own peculiar meaning and purpose in the actual psychic process. This criterion must also be applied to dreams. When, therefore, we seek a psychological explanation of a dream, we must first know what were the preceding experiences out of which it is composed. We must trace the antecedents of every element in the dream picture. Let me give some examples. Someone dreams that she is walking down a street. Suddenly a child crosses in front of her and is run over by a car. We reduce the dream picture to its antecedents with the help of the dreamer's recollection. She recognizes the street as one down which she has walked on a previous day. The child she recognizes as her brother's child, whom she had seen on the previous evening when visiting her brother. The car accident reminds her of an accident that actually occurred a few days before, but of which she had only read about in the newspaper. As we know, most people are satisfied with a reduction of this kind. "Ah," they said, "that's why I had this dream." Obviously, this reduction is quite unsatisfying from the scientific point of view. The dreamer had walked down many streets the previous day. Why was this particular one selected? She had read about several accidents. Why did she select just this one? The discovery of a single antecedent is by no means sufficient, for a plausible determination of the dream image results only from the competition of several causes. The collection of additional material proceeds according to the same principle of recollection, which also has been called the method of free association. As a result, as can readily be understood, it is accumulation of the very diverse and largely heterogeneous material, having apparently nothing in common but the fact of its evidence associative connection with the dream content. Otherwise, it could never have been reproduced by means of this content. How far the collection of such material should go is an important question from the technical point of view. Since the entire psychic content of life could ultimately be disclosed from a single starting point, theoretically the whole of a person's previous life experience might be found in every dream. But we need only collect just so much material as is absolutely necessary in order to understand the dream's meaning. The limitation of material is obviously an arbitrary proceeding in accordance with Kant's principle that to comprehend a thing is to cognize it to the extent necessary for a purpose. For instance, when understanding a survey of the causes of the French Revolution, we could, in amassing our material, include not only the history of medieval France, but also that of Rome and Greece, which certainly would not be necessary for our purpose, since we can understand the historical genesis of the Revolution just as well from much more limited material. In so collecting the material for a dream, we only go so far as seems necessary for us in order to extract from it a valid meaning. Except for the aforesaid arbitrary limitation, the collection of material lies outside of the choice of the investigator. The material collected must now be shifted and examined according to the principles which are always applied to the examination of historical or any other empirical material. The method is essentially a comparative one, which obviously does not work automatically, but is largely dependent on the skill and the aim of the investigator. When a psychological fact has to be explained, it must be remembered that the psychological data necessitates a twofold point of view, namely that of causality and that of finality. I use the word finality intentionally in order to avoid confusion with the content of tytology. By finality, I mean merely the imminent psychological striving for a goal. Instead of striving for a goal, one could also say a sense of purpose. All psychological phenomena have some such sense of purpose inherent in them, and even merely reactive phenomenon like emotional reactions. Anger over an insult has its purpose in revenge. The purpose of ostentatious mournings is to arouse the sympathy of others, and so on. Applying the causal point of view to the material associated with the dream, we reduce the manifest dream content to certain fundamental tendencies or ideas exhibited by the material. These, as one would expect, are of an elementary and general nature. For example, a young man dreams, "I was standing in a strange garden and picked an apple from a tree. I looked about curiously to make sure no one saw me." The associated dream material is a memory of having once, when a boy, picked a couple of pears surreptitiously from the neighbor's garden. The feeling of bad conscience, which is a prominent feature of the dream, reminds him of a situation experienced on a previous day. He met a young lady in the street, a casual acquaintance, and exchanged a few words with her. At that moment a gentleman passed whom he knew, whereupon he was suddenly seized with a curious feeling of embarrassment, as if he were doing something wrong. He associated the apple with the scene in the Garden of Eden, and also with the fact that he had never really understood why the eating of the forbidden fruit should have such dire consequences for our first parents. This had always made him feel angry. It seemed to him an unjust act of God, for God had made men as they were, with all their curiosity and greed. Another association was that sometimes his father had punished him for certain things in a way that seemed to him incomprehensible. The worst punishment had been bestowed on him after he was caught secretly watching girls bathing. This led up to the confession that he had recently begun a love affair with a housemaid, and had not yet carried it through to its natural conclusion. On the evening before the dream, he had had a rendezvous with her. Reviewing this material, we can see that the dream contains a very transparent reference to the last named incident. The associative material shows that the apple episode is obviously intended as an erotic scene. For various other reasons, too, it may be considered extremely probable that the experience of the previous day had gone on working in the dream. In the dream, the young man plucks the apple of paradise, when in reality it has not yet been plucked. The remainder of the material associated with the dream is concerned with another experience of the previous day, namely the peculiar feeling of bad conscience which seized the dreamer when he was talking to his casual lady acquaintance. Then again, this again was associated with the fall of man in paradise, and finally with an erotic misadventure of his childhood, for which his father had punished him severely. All these associations are linked together with the idea of guilt. We shall first consider this material from the causal standpoint of Freud. In other words, we shall interpret the dream, to use Freud's expression. A wish has been left unfulfilled from the day before. In the dream, this wish is fulfilled under the symbol of the apple episode. But why is this fulfilled? Fulfillment disguised and hidden under the symbolic image instead of being expressed in a clearly sexual thought? Freud would point to the unmistakable element of guilt in this material and say that the morality inculcated into the young man from childhood is bent on repressing such wishes, and to that end he brands the natural craving as something painful and incomprehensible. The repressed painful thought can be understood, the repressed painful thought can therefore express itself only symbolically, as these thoughts are incomprehensible within the moral content of consciousness. A psychic authority, postulated by Freud, called the censor, prevents this wish from passing undistinguished into consciousness. Considering a dream from the standpoint of finality, which I contrast with the causal standpoint of Freud, does not, as I would expressly like to emphasize, involve a denial of the dream's causes, but rather a different interpretation of associative material gathered round the dream. The material facts remain the same, but the criticism by which they are judged is different. The question may be formulated simply as follows: what is the purpose of this dream? What effect is it meant to have? These questions are not arbitrary inasmuch as they can be applied to every psychic activity. Everywhere the question of why and wherefore may be raised, because every organic structure consists of a complicated network of purposeful functions, and each of these functions can be resolved into a series of individual facts with a purposeful orientation. It is clear that the material added by the dream to the previous day's erotic experience chiefly emphasizes the element of guilt in the erotic act. The same association had already shown itself to be operative in another experience of the previous day, in that meeting with the casual lady acquaintance, when the feeling of a bad conscience was automatically and inexplicably aroused, as if in that instance too the young man was doing something wrong. This feeling also plays a part in the dream and is further intensified by the association of the additional material, the erotic experience of the day before being depicted by the story of the fall, which was followed by severe punishment. I maintain that there exists in the dreamer an unconscious propensity or tendency to represent his erotic experiences as guilt. In this characteristic that the dream is followed by the association with the fall, and that the young man had never really grasped why the punishment should have been so drastic. This association throws light on the reason why he did not think simply, "What I am doing is not right." Obviously, he does not know that he might condemn his conduct as morally wrong. This is actually the case. His conscious belief is that his conduct does not matter in the least morally, as all his friends were acting in the same way. Besides which, he was quite unable on other grounds to understand why such a fuss should be made about it. Now, whether this dream should be considered meaningful or meaningless depends on a very important question, namely, whether the standpoint of morality handed down through the ages is itself meaningful or meaningless. I do not wish to wander off into a philosophical discussion of this question, but would merely observe that mankind must obviously have had very strong reasons for devising this morality, or otherwise it would be truly incomprehensible why such restraints should be imposed as on one of man's strongest desires. If we give this fact its due, we are bound to pronounce the dream to be meaningful because it shows the young man the necessity of looking at his erotic conduct for once from the standpoint of morality. Primitive tribes have in some respects extremely strict laws concerning sexuality. This proves that sexual morality is a not to be neglected factor in the higher functions of the psyche and deserves to be taken fully into account. In the case in question, we should have to say that the young man, hypnotized by his friend's examples, had somewhat thoughtlessly given way to his erotic desires, unmindful of the fact that man is a morally responsible being who, voluntarily or involuntarily, submits to the morality that he himself has created. In this dream we can discern a compensating function of the unconscious, whereby these thoughts, inclinations, and tendencies, which in conscious life are too little valued and come spontaneously into action during the sleeping state, when the conscious process is to a large extent eliminated. Here the question might certainly be asked, of what use is this to the dreamer if he does not understand the dream? To this I must remark that understanding is not an exclusively intellectual process, for, as experience shows, a man may be influenced, and indeed convinced in the most effective way, by innumerable things of which he has no intellectual understanding. I need only remind my readers of the effectiveness of religious symbols. The above example might lead one to suppose that the function of dreams is a distinctly moral one. Such it appears to be the case. But if we recall the formula that dreams contain the subliminal material of a given moment, we cannot speak simply of a moral function. For it is worth noting that the dreams of those patients whose actions are morally unassailable bring material to light that may well be described as immoral in the ordinary meaning of the term. Thus it is characteristic that St. Augustine was glad that God did not hold him responsible for his dreams. The unconscious is the unknown at any given moment, so it is not surprising that dreams add to the conscious psychological situation of the moment. It is not surprising that dreams add to the psychological situation of the moment all those aspects which are essential for a totally different point of view. It is evident that this function of dreams amounts to a psychological adjustment, a compensation absolutely necessary for properly balanced action. In a conscious process of revelation, it is essential that, as far as possible, we should realize all the aspects and consequences of a problem in order to find the right solution. This process is continued automatically in the more or less unconscious state of sleep, where, as experience seems to show, all those aspects occur to the dreamer, at least by way of illusion, that during the day were insufficiently appreciated or even totally ignored, in other words, were completely unconscious. As regards the much discussed symbolism of dreams, its evaluation varies according to whether it is considered from the casual or from the final standpoint. The casual. The casual approach of Freud starts from a desire or a craving. No, causal. The causal approach of Freud starts from a desire or craving, so it's causal or from a final standpoint. The causal approach of Freud starts from a desire or craving, that is, the repressed dream wish. This craving is always something comparatively simple and elementary, which can hide itself under manifold disguises. Thus, the young man in question could just as well have dreamt that he had to open a door with a key, that he was flying in an aeroplane or kissing his mother, etc. From this point of view, all those things could have had the same meaning. Hence, it is the more rigorous adherents to Freud's school that have come to the point of interpreting, to give a gross example, pretty well all oblong objects in dreams as phallic symbols, and all round or hollow objects as feminine symbols. From the standpoint of finality, the images in a dream each have an intrinsic value of their own. For instance, if the young man, instead of dreaming of the apple scene, had dreamt he had opened a door with a key, this dream image would probably have furnished associative material of an essentially different character, which would have supplanted the conscious situation in a way quite different from the material connected with the apple scene. From this standpoint, the significant lies precisely in the diversity of the symbolical expressions in the dream, and not in their uniformity of meaning. The causal point of view tends by its very nature towards uniformity of meaning, that is, towards a fixed significance of symbols. The final point of view, on the other hand, perceives in an altered dream image the expression of an altered psychological situation. It recognizes no fixed meaning of symbols. From this standpoint, all the dream images are important in themselves, each one having a special significance of its own, to which indeed it owes its inclusion in the dream. Keeping to our previous example, we can see that from the final standpoint, the symbol in the dream has more of a value of a parable. It does not conceal, it teaches. The apple scene vividly recalls the sense of guilt, while at the same time disguising the deed of our first parents. It is clear that we reach very dissimilar interpretations of the meaning of the dream according to the point of view we adopt. The question now arises, which is the better or truer interpretation? After all, for us psychotherapists, it is practical and not merely a theoretical necessity that we should have some interpretation of the meaning of dreams. If we want to treat our patients, we must, for quite practical reasons, endeavor to lay hold of any means that will enable us to educate them effectively. It should be obvious from the foregoing example that the material associated with the dream has touched on a question calculated to open the eyes of the young man to many things which till now he seemed to heedlessly overlook. By disregarding these things, he was really overlooking something in himself, for he had a moral standard and a moral need just like any other man. By trying to live without taking this fact into account, his life was one-sided and incomplete, as if uncoordinated, with the same consequence for psyche life as a one-sided and incomplete diet would have for the body. In order to educate an individuality to completeness and independence, we need to bring to fruition all those functions which have hitherto attained but little conscious development, or none at all. And to achieve this aim, we must, for therapeutic reasons, enter into all the unconscious aspects of the contribution made by the dream material. This makes it abundantly clear that the standpoint of finality is of great importance as an aid to the development of the individual. The causal point of view is obviously more sympathetic to the scientific spirit of our time, with its strictly causalistic reasoning. Much may be said for Freud's view as a scientific explanation of dream psychology, but I must dispute its completeness, for the psyche cannot be conceived merely in causal terms, but requires also a final view. Only a combination of points of view, which has not yet been achieved in a scientifically satisfactory manner, owing to the enormous difficulties, both practical and theoretical, that still remain to be overcome, can give us a more complete conception of the nature of dreams. I would like now to treat briefly of some further problems of dream psychology which are contingent to a general discussion of dreams. First, as to the classification of dreams, I would not put too high a value either on the practical or on the theoretical importance of this question. I investigate yearly some 1,500 or 2,000 dreams, and on the basis of this experience I can assert that typical dreams do actually exist, but they are not very frequent, and from the final point of view they lose much of their importance which the causal standpoint attaches to them on account of the fixed significance of symbols. It seems to me that the typical motifs in dream are of much greater importance, since they permit a comparison with the motifs of mythology. Many of those mythological motifs, in collecting which Frobenius in particular has rendered such signal service, are also found in dreams, often with precisely the same significance. Though I cannot enter into this question more fully here, I would like to emphasize that the comparison of typical dream motifs with those of mythology suggests that the idea already put forward in Nietzsche, that dream thinking should be regarded as a phylogenetically older mode of thought. Instead of multiplying examples, I can best show what I mean by reference to our specimen dream. It will be remembered that the dream introduced the apple scene as a typical way of representing erotic guilt. The thought abstracted from this would boil down to, I am doing wrong by acting like this. It is characteristic that dreams never express themselves in this logical, abstract way, but always in the language of parables or simile. This is also characteristic of primitive languages, whose flowery turns of phrase are very striking. If we remember the monuments of ancient literature, we find that nowadays what nowadays is expressed by means of abstractions was then expressed mostly by similes. Even a philosopher like Plato did not disdain to express certain fundamental ideas in this way. Just as the body bears the traces of its phylogenetic development, so also does the human mind. Here, there is nothing surprising about the possibility that figurative language of dreams is a survival from the archaic mode of thought. At the same time, the theft of the apple is a typical dream motif that occurs in many different variations in numerous dreams. It is also a well-known mythological motif, which is found not only in the story of the Garden of Eden, but in countless myths and fairy tales from all ages and climes. It is one of those universally human symbols which can reappear autotechnomously in anyone at any time. Thus, dream psychology opens the way to a general comparative psychology from which we may hope to gain the same understanding of the development and structure of the human psyche as comparative anatomy has given us concerning the human body. Dreams, then, convey to us in figurative language, that is, in sensuous concrete imagery, thoughts, judgments, views, directives, tendencies, which were unconscious either because of repression or through mere lack of realization. Precisely because they are contents of the unconscious, the dream is a derivative of unconscious process. It contains a reflection of the unconscious content. It is not a reflection of unconscious contents in general, but only of certain contents, which are linked together associatively and are selected by the conscious selection of the moment, by the conscious situation of the moment. I regard this observation as a very important one in practice. If we want to interpret a dream correctly, we need a thorough knowledge of the conscious situation at the moment, because the dream contains its unconscious complement, that is, the material which the conscious situation has constellated in the unconscious. Without this knowledge, it is impossible to interpret a dream correctly, except by a lucky fluke. I would like to illustrate this by an example. A man once came to me for a first consultation. He told me that he was engaged in all sorts of learned pursuits, and was also interested in psychoanalysis from a literary point of view. He was in the best of health, he said, and was not to be considered in any sense a patient. He was merely pursuing his psychoanalytic interests. He was very comfortably off and had plenty of time to devote himself to his pursuits. He wanted to make my acquaintance in order to be induced by me into the theoretical secrets of analysis. He admitted it must be very boring for me to have to do with such a normal person, since I must certainly find mad people much more interesting. He had written to me a few days before to ask when I could see him. In the course of conversation we soon came to the question of dreams. I therefore asked him whether he had had a dream on the night before he visited me. He affirmed this, and told me the following dream. I was in a bare room. A sort of nurse received me, and wanted me to sit at a table, on which stood a bottle of fermented milk, which I was supposed to drink. I wanted to go to Dr. Jung, but the nurse told me that I was in the hospital, and that Dr. Jung had no time to receive me. It is clear even from the manifest content of the dream that the anticipated visit to me had somehow constellated his unconscious. He gave the following association: bare room, a sort of frosty reception room, as in the official building, or the waiting room in a hospital. I was never in a hospital as a patient. Nurse. She looked repulsive. She was cross-eyed. That reminds me of a fortune-teller and palmist whom I once visited to have my fortune told. Once I was sick and had a deaconess as a nurse. Bottle of fermented milk. Fermented milk is nauseating. I cannot drink it. My wife is always drinking it, and I make fun of her for this because she is obsessed with the idea that one must always be doing something for one's health. I remember I was once in a sanatorium. My nerves were not so good, and there I had to drink fermented milk. At this point I interrupted him with an indiscreet question. Had his neurosis entirely disappeared since then? He tried to worm out of it, but finally had to admit that he still had his neurosis, and that actually his wife had for a very long time been urging him to consult me. But he certainly didn't feel so nervous that he had to consult me on that account, for he was after all not mad, and I treated only mad people. It was merely that he was interested in learning about my psychological theories, etc. From this we can see how the patient has falsified the situation. It suits his fantasy to come to me in the guise of a philosopher and psychologist and to allow the fact of his neurosis to recede into the background. But the dream reminds him of it in a very disagreeable way and forces him to tell the truth. He has to swallow this bitter drink. His recollection of the fortune-teller shows us very clearly just how he had imagined my activities. As the dream informs us, he must first submit to treatment before he can get to me. The dream rectifies the situation. It contributes the material that was lacking and therefore improves the patient's attitude. This is the reason we need dream analysis in our therapy. I do not wish to give the impression that all dreams are as simple as this one, or that they are all of this type. I believe it is true that all dreams are compensatory to the content of consciousness, but certainly not in all dreams is the compensatory function so clear as this example. The dreams contribute to the self-regulation of the psyche by automatically bringing up everything that is repressed or neglected or unknown. Their compensatory significance is often not immediately apparent because we still have only a very incomplete knowledge of the nature and needs of the human psyche. There are psychological compensations that seem to be very remote from the problem at hand. In these cases, one must always remember that every person, in a sense, represents the whole of humanity and its history. What was possible in the history of mankind at large is also possible on a small scale in every individual. What mankind has needed may eventually be needed by the individual too. It is therefore not surprising that religious compensations play a great role in dream. That this is increasingly so in our time is a natural consequence of the prevailing materialism of our outlook. Lest it be thought that the compensatory significance of dreams is a new discovery or has simply been made up to suit the convenience of interpretation, I shall cite a very old and well-known example which can be found in the fourth chapter of the book of Daniel, 10-14 AV. When Nebuchadnezzar was at the height of his power, he had the following dream. I saw, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and the height thereof was great. The tree grew and was strong, and the height thereof reached unto heaven, and the sight thereof to the end of all the earth. The leaves thereof were fair, and the fruit thereof much, and it was meat for all. The beasts of the field had shadow under it, and the fowls of the heaven dwelt in the boughs thereof, and all flesh was fed of it. I saw in the visions of my head upon my bed, and behold, a watcher and an holy one came down from heaven. He cried aloud and said thus, Hew down the tree, and cut off his branches, shake off his leaves, and scatter his fruits, lest the beasts get away from under it, and the fowls from his branches. Nevertheless, leave the stump of his roots in the earth, even with a band of iron and brass in the tender grass of the field, and let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts in the grass of the earth. Let his heart be changed from man's, and let a beast's heart be given unto him, and let 7 times pass over him. In the second part of the dream, the tree becomes personified, so that it is easy to see that the great tree is the dreaming king himself. Daniel interprets the dream in this sense. Its meaning is obviously an attempt to compensate the king's megalomania, which, according to the story, developed into a real psychosis. To interpret the dream process as compensatory is, in my view, entirely consistent with the nature of the biological process in general. Freud's view tends in the same direction, since he too ascribes a compensatory role to dreams, insofar as they preserve sleep. There are, as Freud has demonstrated, dreams which show how certain external stimuli would rob the dreamer of sleep, are distorted in such a way that they abet they abet the wish to sleep, or rather the desire not to be disturbed. Equally, there are innumerable dreams in which, as Freud was able to show, intrapsychic excitations, such as personal ideas, that would be likely to release powerful affective reactions, are distorted in such a way as to fit with the dream context, which disguises the painful ideas and makes any strong affective reaction impossible. As against this, we should not overlook the fact that the very dreams which disturb sleep the most, and those which are not uncommon, have a dramatic structure which aims logically at creating a highly effective situation and builds it up so efficiently that the affect unquestionably wakes the dreamer. Freud explains these dreams by saying that the censor was no longer able to suppress the painful affect. It seems to me that this explanation fails to do justice to the facts. Dreams which concern themselves in a very disagreeable manner with the painful experiences and activities of daily life, and expose just the most disturbing thoughts with the most painful distinctiveness, are known to everyone. It would, in my opinion, be justified to speak here on the dream's sleep-preserving, affect-disguising function. One would have to stand reality on its head to see in these dreams a confirmation of Freud's view. The same is true in those cases where repressed sexual fantasies appear undisguised in the manifest dream content. I have therefore come to the conclusion that Freud's view that dreams have an essentially wish-fulfilling and sleep-preserving function is too narrow, even though the basic thought of a compensatory biological function is certainly correct. This compensatory function is concerned only to a limited extent with the sleeping state. Its chief significance is rather in relation to conscious life. Dreams, I maintain, are compensatory to the conscious situation of the moment. They preserve sleep whenever possible, that is to say, they function necessarily and automatically under the influence of the sleeping state, but they break through when their function demands it, that is, when the compensatory contents are so intense that they are able to counteract sleep. A compensatory content is especially intense when it has a vital significance for conscious orientation. As far back as 1907, I pointed out the compensatory relation between consciousness and the split-off complexes, and also emphasized their purposive character. Flournoy did the same thing independently of me. Flournoy. For these observations, the possibility of purposive unconscious impulses becomes evident. It should be emphasized, however, that the final orientation of the unconscious does not run parallel with our conscious intentions. As a rule, the unconscious content contrasts strikingly with the conscious material, particularly when the conscious attitude tends too exclusively in a direction that would threaten the vital need of the individual. The more one-sided his conscious attitude is, and the further it deviates from the optimum, the greater becomes the possibility that vivid dreams with a strongly contrasting but purposive content will appear as an expression of the self-regulation of the psyche. Just as the body reacts purposefully to injuries or infections or any abnormal conditions, so the psychic function reacts to unnatural or dangerous disturbances with purposive defense mechanisms. Among these purposive reactions we must include the dream, since it furnishes the unconscious material constellated in a given conscious situation and supplies to it consciousness in symbolic form. In this material are to be found all those associations which remain unconscious because of their feeble accentuation, but which still possess sufficient energy to make themselves perceptible in the sleeping state. Naturally, the purposive nature of the dream content is not immediately discernible from outside without further investigation. An analysis of the manifest dream content is required before we can get at the really compensatory factors in the latent dream content. Most of the physical defense mechanisms are of this non-obvious and, so to speak, indirect nature, and their purposiveness can be recognized only after careful investigation. I need only remind you of the significance of fever or of suppuration process in an infected wound. The process of psychic compensation are almost always of a very individual nature, and this makes the task of proving their compensatory character considerably more difficult. Because of this peculiarity, it is often very difficult, especially for the beginner, to see how far a dream content has compensatory significance. On the basis of the compensation theory, one would be inclined to assume, for instance, that anyone with too pessimistic attitude to life must have very cheerful and optimistic dreams. This expectation is true only in the case of someone whose nature allows him to be stimulated and encouraged in this way. But if he has a rather different nature, his dreams will purposefully assume a much blacker character than his conscious attitude. They can then follow the principle of like curing like. It is therefore not easy to lay down any special rule for the type of dream compensation. Its character is always closely bound up with the whole nature of the individual. The possibilities of compensation are without number and inexhaustible, though with increasing experience certain basic features gradually crystallize out. In putting forward a compensation theory, I do not wish to assert that this is the only possible theory of dreams, or that it completely explains all the phenomena of dream life. The dream is an extraordinarily complicated phenomenon, just as complicated and unfathomable as the phenomenon of consciousness. It would be inappropriate to try to understand all conscious phenomena from the standpoint of wish fulfillment theory or the theory of instinct, and it is less likely that dream phenomena are susceptible of so simple an explanation. Nor should we regard dream phenomena as merely compensatory and secondary to the contents of consciousness, even though it is commonly supposed that conscious life is of far greater significance for the individual than the unconscious. This view, however, may yet have to be reversed, for, as our experience deepens, it will be realized that the function of the unconscious in the life of the psyche has an importance of which we perhaps still have too low an estimate. It is analytical experience, above all, which has discovered to an increasing degree the influence of the unconscious on our conscious psychic life, influences whose existence and significance had till then been overlooked. In my view, which is based on many years of experience and an extensive research, the significance of the unconscious in the total performance of the psyche is probably just as great as that of consciousness. Should this view prove correct, then not only should the function of the unconscious be regarded as compensatory and relative to the content of the consciousness, but the content of consciousness would have to be regarded as relative to the momentary constellated unconscious content. In this case, active orientation towards goals and purposes would not be the privilege of consciousness alone, but would also be true of the unconscious, so that it too would be just as capable of taking a finally oriented lead. The dream, accordingly, would then have the value of a positive guiding idea, or of an aim whose vital meaning would be greatly superior to that of the momentary constellated conscious content. This possibility meets with the approval of the consensus gentium, since in the superstitions of all times and races the dreams have been regarded as a truth-telling oracle. Making allowances for exaggeration and prejudice, there is always a grain of truth in such widely disseminated views. Maeder has laid energetic stress on the prospective final significance of dreams as a purposive, unconscious function which paves the way for the solution of real conflicts and problems, and seeks to portray it with the help of groupingly chosen symbols. I should like to distinguish between the prospective function of dreams and their compensatory function. The latter means that the unconscious, considered as relative to consciousness, adds to the conscious situation adds to the conscious situation all those elements from the previous day which remained subliminal because of repression or because they were simply too feeble to reach consciousness. This compensation, in the sense of being self-regulation of the psychic organism, must be called purposive. The prospective function, on the other hand, is an anticipation of in the unconscious of future conscious achievements, something like a preliminary exercise or sketch, or a plan roughed out in advance. Its symbolic content sometimes outlines the solution of a conflict, excellent examples of this being given in Mater. The occurrence of prospective dreams cannot be denied. It would be wrong to call them prophetic because at the bottom they are no more prophetic than a medical diagnosis or a weather forecast. They are merely an anticipatory combination of probabilities which may coincide with the actual behavior of things but need not necessarily agree in every detail. Only in the latter case can we speak of prophecy. That the prospective function of dreams is sometimes greatly superior to the combination we can consciously foresee is not surprising, since a dream results from the fusion of subliminal elements and is thus a combination of all the perceptions, thoughts, and feelings which consciousness has not registered because of their feeble accentuation. In addition, dreams can rely on subliminal memory traces that are no longer able to influence consciousness effectively. With regard to prognosis, therefore, dreams are often in a much more favorable position than consciousness. Although the prospective function is, in my view, an essential characteristic of dreams, one would do well not to overestimate this function, for one might easily be led to suppose that the dream is a kind of psychopomp, which, because of its superior knowledge, infallibly guides life in the right direction. However much people underestimate the psychological significance of dreams, there is an equally great danger that anyone who is constantly preoccupied with dream analysis will overestimate the significance of the unconscious for real life. But judging from all previous experience, we do not have a right to assume that the importance of the unconscious is about equal to that of conscious. Undoubtedly, there are conscious attitudes which are surpassed by the unconscious, attitudes so badly adapted to the individual as a whole that the unconscious attitude or constellation is a far better expression of his essential nature. But this by no means is always the case. Often the dream contributes only the merest fragments to the conscious attitude, because the latter is on the one hand sufficiently well adapted to reality, and on the other hand satisfies fairly well the nature of the individual. A more or less exclusive regard for the dream standpoint, without considering the conscious situation, would be inappropriate in this case, and would serve only to confuse and disrupt the conscious performance. Only if there is an obviously unsatisfactory and defective conscious attitude have we a right to allow the unconscious a higher value. The criteria necessary for such a judgment constitute, of course, a delicate problem. It goes without saying that the value of a conscious attitude can never be judged from an exclusively collective standpoint. For this, a thorough investigation of the individuality in question is needed, and only from an accurate knowledge of the individual character can it be cited in what respect the conscious attitude is unsatisfactory. When I lay stress on knowledge of individual character, I do not mean that the demands of the collective standpoint should be entirely neglected. As we know, the individual is not conditioned by himself alone, but just as much by his collective relationships. When, therefore, the conscious attitude is more or less adequate, the meaning of the dream will be confined simply to its compensatory function. This is the general rule for the normal individual living under normal inner and outer conditions. For these reasons, it seems to me that the compensation theory provides the right formula and fits the facts by giving dreams a compensatory function in the self-regulation of the psychic organism. But when the individual deviates from the norm in the sense that his conscious attitude is unadapted both objectively and subjectively, under normal conditions, Merely compensatory function of the unconscious becomes a guiding perspective function capable of leading the conscious attitude in a quite different direction, which is much better than the previous one, as Mater has successfully shown in the books I have mentioned. Into this category come dreams of the Nibbachadaznesera type. It is obvious that dreams of this sort are found chiefly in the people who are not living to their true level. It is equally obvious that this lack of proportion is very frequent. Hence, we have frequent occasions to consider dreams from the standpoint of their prospective value. This is yet another side of dreams to be considered, and one that should certainly not be overlooked. There are many people whose conscious attitude is defective, not as regards adaptation to environment, but as regards expression of their own character. These are people whose conscious attitude and adaptive performance exceeds their capacities as individuals. That is to say, they appear to be better and more valuable than they really are. Their outward success is naturally never paid for out of their individual resources alone, but very largely out of the dynamic reserves generated by collective suggestion. Such people climb above their natural level thanks to the influence of a collective ideal, or the lure of some social advantage, or the support offered by society. They have not grown inwardly to the level of their outer eminence, for which reasons the unconscious, in all cases, has a negatively compensating or reductive function. It is clear that in these circumstances a reduction or devaluation is just as much a compensatory effort at self-regulation as in other cases, and also that this function may be eminently prospective, witness Nebuchadnezzar's dream. We like to associate prospective with the idea of construction, preparation, and synthesis. But in order to understand these reductive dreams, we must entirely divorce the term prospective from any idea, for reductive dreams have an effect that this is the very reverse of constructive, preparatory, or synthetic. It tends rather to disintegrate, to dissolve, to devalue, even to destroy and demolish. This is naturally not to say that the assimilation of a reductive content must have an altogether destructive effect on the individual as a whole. On the contrary, the effect is often very salutary, insofar as it affects merely his attitude and not the entire personality. But this secondary effect does not alter the essential character of such dreams, which bear a thoroughly reductive and retrospective stamp, and for this reason cannot properly be called prospective. For purposes of exact qualification, it would be better to call them reductive dreams, and the corresponding function a reductive function of the unconscious altogether at bottom. It is still the same compensatory function. We must accustom ourselves to the fact that the unconscious does not always present the same aspect in any more than the conscious attitude does. It alters in appearance and its function just as much as the latter, which is another reason why it is so extremely difficult to form any concrete idea of the nature of the unconscious. Our knowledge of the reductive function of the unconscious we owe mainly to the research of Freud. His dream interpretation limits itself in essentials to the repressed personal background of the individual and the infantile sexual aspects. Subsequent research then established the bridge to the archaic elements, to the suprapersonal, historical, phylogenetic functions residing in the unconscious. Today we can safely assert that the reductive function of dreams constellates material which consists in the main of the repressed infantile sexual wishes, Freud, infantile claims to power, Adler, and suprapersonal archaic elements of thoughts, feelings, and instinct. The reproduction of such elements, with their thoroughly retrospective character, does more than anything else to undermine effectively a position that is too high, and to reduce the individual to his human nullity and his dependence on psychological, historical, and phylogenic conditions. Every appearance of false grandeur and importance melts away before the reductive imagery of the dream, which analyzes his conscious attitude with pitiless criticism and brings up devastating material containing a complete inventory of all his most painful weaknesses. One is precluded at the outset from calling such a dream a prospective, for everything in it, down to the last detail, is retrospective and can be traced back to a past which the dreamer imagined long since buried. This naturally does not prevent the dreamer content from being compensatory to the conscious content and finally over-oriented, since the reductive tendency may sometimes be of the utmost importance for adaptation. Patients can often feel quite spontaneously how the dream content is related to their conscious situation, and it is felt to be prospective, reductive, or compensatory in accordance with this sensed knowledge. Yet this is not always so by a long way, and it must be emphasized that in general, particularly at the beginning of an analysis, the patient has been an insuperable tendency to interpret the results of the analytical investigation of his material obstinately in terms of his pathogenic attitude. Such cases need the help of the analyst in order to interpret their dreams correctly. This makes it exceedingly important how the analyst judges the conscious psychology of his patient. For dream analysis is not just the practical applications of a method that can be learned mechanically. It presupposes a familiarity with the whole analytical point of view, and this can only be acquired if the analyst has been analyzed himself. The greatest mistake an analyst can make is to assume that his patient has a psychological similarity to his own. This projection may hit the mark once, but mostly it remains a mere projection. Everything that is unconscious is projected, and for this reason the analyst should be conscious of at least the most important contents of his unconscious, lest unconscious projections cloud his judgment. Everyone who analyzes the dreams of others should constantly bear in mind that there is no simple and generally known theory of psychic phenomena, neither with regard to their nature, nor to their causes, nor their purpose. We therefore possess no general criterion of judgment. We know that there are all kinds of psychic phenomena, but we know nothing certain about their essential nature. We know only that, through the observation of the psyche from any isolated standpoint, can yield very valuable results. It can never produce a satisfactory theory from which one could make deductions. The sexual theory and the wish theory, like the power theory, are valuable points of view without, however, doing anything like justice to the profundity and richness of the human psyche. Had we a theory that did, we could then content ourselves with learning a method mechanically. It would then be simply a matter of reading certain signs that stood for fixed contents. And for this would be only for this it would only be necessary to learn a few semiotic rules by heart. Knowledge and correct assessments of the conscious situation would then be superfluous, as in the performance of a lumbar puncture. The overworked practitioner of our day has learnt to his sorrow that the psyche remains completely refractory to all methods that approach it from a certain exclusive standpoint. At present, the only thing we know about the contents of the unconscious, apart from the fact that they are subliminal, is that they stand in a compensatory relationship to consciousness and are therefore essentially relative. It is for this reason that knowledge of the conscious situation is necessary if we want to understand dreams. Reductive, prospective, or simply compensatory dreams do not exhaust the possibilities of interpretation. There is a type of dream which could be called simply a reaction dream. One would be inclined to class in this category all the dreams which seem to be nothing more than the reproduction of an experience changed with affect. Did not the analysis of such dreams disclose the deeper reason why these experiences are reproduced so faithfully? It turns out that these experiences also have a symbolic side which escape the dreamer, and only because of this side is the experience reproduced in the dream. These dreams, however, do not belong to the reactive type, but only to those in respect of which certain objective events have caused a trauma that is not merely psychic, but at the same time a physical lesion of the nervous system. Such cases of severe shock were produced in abundance by the war, and here we may expect a large number of pure reaction dreams in which the trauma is the determining factor. Although it is certainly very important for the overall functioning of the psyche that the traumatic contents generally loses its autonomy by frequent repetition, and in this way takes its place again in the physical hierarchy, a dream of this kind, which is essentially only a reproduction of the trauma, can hardly be called compensatory. Apparently, it brings back a split-off autonomous part of the psyche, but it soon proves that conscious assimilation of the fragment reproduced by the dream does not by any means put an end to the disturbance which determined the dream. The dream calmly goes on reproducing, that is to say, the contents of the trauma, now become autonomous, and goes on working and will continue to do so until the traumatic stimulus has exhausted itself. Until that happens, conscious realization is useless. In practice, it is not easy to discuss whether a dream is essentially reactive or is merely reproducing a traumatic situation symbolically, but analysis can decide the question, because in the latter case the reproduction of the traumatic scene ceases at once if the interpretation is correct, whereas reactive reproduction is left undisturbed by dream analysis. We find similar reactive dreams in pathological physical conditions where, for instance, severe pain influences the course of the dream. But, in my view, it is only in exceptional cases that somatic stimuli are the determining factor. Usually they coalesce completely with the symbolical expression of the unconscious dream content. In other words, they are used as a means of expression. Not infrequently, the dream shows that there is a remarkable inner symbolical connection between an undoubted physical illness and the definite psychic problem, so that the psychical disorder appears as a direct mimetic expression of the psychic situation. I mention this curious fact more for the sake of completeness than to lay any particular stress on the problematic phenomenon. It seems to me, however, that a definite connection does exist between physical and psychic disturbances, and that its significance is generally underrated, though, on the other hand, it is boundlessly exaggerated owing to certain tendencies to regard psychic disturbances merely as an expression of psychic disturbances, as is particularly the case in the Christian Science dreams the case with Christian Science. Dreams throw very interesting sidelights on the interfunctioning of body and psyche, which is why I raise the question here. Another dream determinant that deserves mention is telepathy. The authenticity of this phenomenon can no longer be disputed today. It is, of course, very simple to deny its existence without examining the evidence. But that is a very unscientific procedure, which is unworthy of notice. I have found by experience that telepathy does in fact influence dreams, as has been asserted since ancient times. Certain people are particularly sensitive in this respect and often have telepathical influence, influence dreams. But in acknowledgement of the phenomenon of telepathy, I am not giving unqualified assent to the popular theory of an action at a distance. The phenomenon undoubtedly exists, but the theory of it does not seem to me to be so simple. In every case, one must consider the possibilities of concordance of associations, of parallel psychic processes, which have been shown to play a very great role, especially in families, which also manifest themselves in an identity or far-reaching similarity of attitude. Equally, one must take into account the possibility of cryptomnesia, on which special emphasis has been laid by Flourny. It sometimes causes the most astonishing phenomena. Since any kind of subliminal material shows up in a dream, it is not at all surprising that cryptomnesia sometimes appears as the determining factor. I have had frequent occasion to analyze telepathic dreams, among them special whose telepathic significance was still unknown at the moment of the analysis. The analysis yielded subjective material like any other dream analysis, in consequence of which the dream had a significance that bore on the situation of the dreamer at the moment. It yielded nothing that could have shown that the dream was telepathic. So far, I have found no dream in which the telepathic content lay beyond a doubt in the associative material brought up by analysis, i.e., the latent dream content. It invariably lay in the manifest dream content. Unfortunately, in the literature of telepathic dreams, only those are mentioned that a powerfully effective event is anticipated telepathically in space or time. That is to say, when the human importance of the event, such as a death, would help to explain the premonition of it or the perception at a distance, or at least make it more intelligible. The telepathic dreams I have observed are mostly of this type. A few of them, however, were distinguished by the remarkable fact that the manifest dream content contained a deep telepathic statement about something completely unimportant. For example, the face of an unknown and quite commonplace individual, or a certain arrangement of furniture in different surroundings, or the arrival of an unimportant letter, etc. Naturally, when I say unimportant, I mean only that neither by the usual questioning nor by analysis could I discover any content whose importance would have justified the telepathic phenomenon. In such a case, one is inclined more so than in those first mentioned to think of chance, but it seems to me, unfortunately, that hypothesis of chance is always an asylum ignorantiae. Certainly, no one will deny that very strange chance events do occur, but the fact that one can count with some probability on their repetition excludes their chance nature. I would not, of course, assert that the law behind them is anything supernatural, but merely something which we cannot get at with our present knowledge. Thus even questionable telepathic contents possess a reality character that mocks all expectations of probability. Although I would not presume a theoretical opinion on these matters, I nevertheless considered it right to recognize and emphasize their reality. This standpoint brings an enrichment to dream analysis. As against Freud's view that the dream is essentially a wish fulfillment, I hold with my friend and collaborator Alfonso Maeder that the dream is spontaneous self-betrayal in symbolic form of the actual situation in the unconscious. Our view coincides at this point with the conclusions of Silberer. The agreement with Silberer is the more gratifying in that it came about as a result of mutually independent work. Now this view contradicts Freud's formula only insofar as it declines to make a definite statement about the meaning of dreams. Our formula merely says that the dream is a symbolical representation of an unconscious content. It leaves the question open whether these contents are always wish fulfillments. Further researches, expressly referred to by Maeder, have shown that the sexual language of dreams is not always to be interpreted in a concretatic way, that is, in fact, an archaic language which naturally uses all the analogies readers readiest to hand without their necessarily coinciding with any real sexual content. It is therefore unjustifiable to take the sexual language of dreams literally under all circumstances, while other contents are explained as symbolical. But as soon as you take the sexual metaphor as symbols for something unknown, your conception of the nature of dreams at once deepens. Maeder has demonstrated this from a practical example given by Freud. So long as the sexual language of dreams is understood concretistically, there can only be a direct, outward, and concrete solution, or else nothing is done at all. One resigns oneself opportunistically to one's inveterate cowardice or laziness. But there is no real conception of, and no attitude to, the problem. But that immediately becomes possible when the concretic misconception is dropped, that is, when the patient stops taking the unconscious sexual language of the dream literally and interpreting the dream figures as real persons. Just as we tend to assume that the world is seen as we see it, we naively suppose that people are as we imagine them to be. In this latter case, unfortunately, there is no scientific test that would prove the discrepancy between perception and reality. Although the possibility of gross deception is infinitely greater than in our perception of the physical world, We still go on naively projecting our own psychology onto our fellow human beings. In this way, everyone creates for himself a series of more or less imaginary relationships based essentially on projection. Among neurotics, there are even cases where fantasy projections provide the sole means of human relationship. A person who I perceive mainly through my projections is an imago, or alternately, a carrier of imagos or symbols. All the contents of our unconscious are constantly being projected onto our surroundings, and it is only by recognizing certain properties of the objects as projections or imagos that we are able to distinguish them from the real properties of the object. But if we are not aware that a property of the object is a projection, we cannot do anything else but be naively convinced that it really does belong to the object. All human relationships swarm with these projections. Anyone who can see this in her personal life need only have her attention drawn to the psychology of the press in wartime. Cum grano salis, we always see our own unavowed mistakes in our opponent. Excellent examples of this are to be found in all personal quarrels. Unless we are possessed of an unusual degree of self-awareness, we shall never see through our projections, but must always succumb to them, because the mind in its natural state presupposes the existence of such projections. It is the natural and given thing for unconscious contents to be projected. It is a comparatively primitive person. In a comparatively primitive person, this creates that characteristic relationship to the objects which Lévi-Breuil has fittingly called mystic identity, or participation mystique. Thus, every normal person of our time who is not reflective beyond the average is bound to her environment by a whole system of projections. So long as all goes well, she is totally unaware of the compulsive, i.e. magical or mystical character of these relationships. But if a paranoid disturbance sets in, then these unconscious relationships turn into so many compulsive ties decked out, as a rule, with the same unconscious material that formed the contents of these projections during the normal state. So long as the libido can use the projections as agreeable and convenient bridges to the world, they will alleviate life in a positive way. But as soon as the libido wants to strike out on another path, and for this purpose begins running back along the previous bridges of projection, they will work as the greatest hindrance whereas it is possible to imagine, for they effectively prevent any real detachment from the former object. We then witness the characteristic phenomena of a person trying to devalue the former object as much as possible in order to detach her libido from it. But as the previous identity is due to the projection of subjective contents, complete and final detachment can only take place when the imago that mirrored itself in the object is restored, together with its meaning, to the subject. This restoration is achieved through conscious recognition of the projected content, that is, by acknowledging the symbolic value of the object. The frequency of such projections is as certain as the fact that they are never seen through. That being so, it is hardly surprising that the naive person takes it as a self-evident from the start, when he dreams of Mr. X, that this dream image is identical with the real Mr. X. It is an assumption that is entirely in accordance with her ordinary uncritical, her critical, conscious attitude, which makes no distinction between the object as such and the idea one has of it. But there is no denying that, looking at critically, the dream image has only an outward and very limited connection with the object. In reality, it is a complex of psychic factors that has fashioned itself, albeit under the influence of certain external stimuli, and therefore consists mainly of subjective factors that are peculiar to the subject, and often have very little to do with the real object. We understand another person in the same way as we understand or seek to understand ourselves. We do not understand in ourselves what we do not understand in ourselves, we do not understand in the other person either. So there is plenty to ensure that her image will be for the most part subjective. As we know, even our intimate friendship is no guarantee of objective knowledge. Now, if one begins, as the Freudian school does, by taking this manifest content of the dreams as unreal or symbolical, and explains that though the dream speaks of a church spire, it really means a phallus, then it is only a step to saying that the dream often speaks of sexuality, but does not always mean it, and equally, the dream often speaks of the father, but really means the dreamer himself. Our imagos are constituents of our minds, and if our dreams reproduce certain ideas, these ideas are primarily our ideas, in the structure of which our whole being is interwoven. They are subjective factors, grouping themselves as they do in the dream, and expressing this or that meaning, not for extraneous reasons, but from the most intimate promptings of our psyche. The whole dream work is essentially subjective, and a dream is a theater in which the dreamer is himself the scene, the player, the prompter, the producer, the author, the public, and the critic. This simple truth forms the basis for a conception of the dream's meaning, which I call interpretation at the subjective level. Such an interpretation, as the term implies, conceives all the figures in the dream as personified features of the dreamer's own personality. This view has aroused a considerable amount of resistance. One line of argument appeals to the naive assumption we have just mentioned concerning Mr. X. Another argument is based on the question of principle, which is the more important, the objective or the subjective level. I can really think of no valid objection to the theoretical probability of a subjective level, but the second problem is considerably more difficult. For just as the image of an object is composed subjectively on the outside, it is conditioned objectively on the other side. When I reproduce it myself, I am putting something that is determined as much subjectively as objectively. In order to decide which side predominates in any given case, it must first be shown whether the image is reproduced for its subjective or its objective significance. If, therefore, I dream of a person with whom I am connected by a vital interest, the interpretation on the objective level will certainly be nearer to the truth than the other, but if I dream of a person who is not important to me in reality, then interpretation on the subjective level will be nearer the truth. It is, however, possible, and this happens very frequently in practice, that the dreamer will have at once associated this unimportant person with someone for whom she is connected by a strong emotion or affect. Formerly, one would have said, the unimportant figure has been thrust forward in the dream intentionally, in order to cover up the painfulness of the other figure. In that case, I would follow the path of nature and say, in the dream that has highly emotional reminiscence, one has obviously been replaced by the unimportant figure of Mr. X. Hence, interpretation on the subjective level would be nearer the truth. To be sure, the substitution achieved by the dream amounts to a repression of a painful reminiscence. But if this reminiscence can be thrust aside so easily, it cannot at all be that important. The substitution shows that this personal affect allows itself to be depersonalized. I can therefore rise above it, and I shall not get myself back into that personal, emotional situation again by devaluing and that depersonalization achieved by the dream as a mere repression. I think I am acting more correctly if I regard the replacement of the painful figure by an unimportant one as a depersonification of the previously personal affect. In this way, the affect, or the corresponding sum of libido, has become impersonal, freed from its personal attachment to the object, and I can now shift the previous real conflict onto the subjective plane and try to understand to what extent it is an exclusively subjective conflict. I would like, for clarity's sake, to illustrate this by a short example. I once had a personal conflict with a Mr. A, in the course of which I generally came to the conclusion that the fault was more on his side than on mine. About the same time I had the following dream. I consulted a lawyer on a certain matter, and to my boundless astonishment he demanded a fee of no less than 5,000 francs for the consultation, which I strenuously resisted. The lawyer was an important reminiscence of my student days, but the student period was important because at that time I got into many arguments and disputes. With a surge of affect, I associated the brusque manner of the lawyer with the personality of Mr. A, which also with the and also with the continuing conflict. I could now proceed on the objective level and say, Mr. A is hiding behind the lawyer, therefore Mr. A is asking too much of me. He is in the wrong. Shortly before this dream, a poor student approached me for a loan of 5,000 francs. Thus, by association, Mr. A is a poor student in need of help and incompetent because he is at the beginning of his studies. Such a person has no right to make any demands or have any opinions. That, then, would be the wish fulfillment. My opponent would be gently devalued and pushed aside, and my peace of mind would be preserved. But in reality I woke up to this point with the liveliest affect, furious with the lawyer for his presumption. So I was not in the least calmed by the wish fulfillment. Sure enough, behind the lawyer is the unpleasant affair with Mr. A. But it is significant that the dream should dig up that unimportant jurist from my student days. I associate lawyer with lawsuit, being in the self-righteousness, and hence with that memory from my student days when, right or wrong, I often defended my thesis tenaciously, obstinately, self-righteously, in order at least to win for myself the appearance of superiority by fighting for it. All this, so I felt, has played its part in the dispute with Mr. A. Then I know that he is really myself, that part of me that is unadapted to the present and demands too much, just as I used to. In other words, squeezes too much libido out of me. I know then that the dispute with Mr. A cannot die because the self-righteous disputant in me would still like to see it brought into its rightful conclusion. This interpretation led to what seemed to be a meaningful result to me, whereas interpretation on the objective level was unproductive, since I am not in the least interested in proving that dreams are wish fulfillments. If a dream shows me what sort of mistake I am making, it gives me an opportunity to correct my attitude, which is always an advantage. Naturally, such a result can only be achieved through interpretation on the subjective level. Enlightening as interpretation on the subjective level may be in such a case, it may be entirely worthless when a vitally important relationship is the content and the cause of the conflict. Here the dream figure must be related to the real object. The criterion can always be discovered from the conscious material, except in cases where the transference enters into the problem. The transference can easily cause falsifications of judgment, so that the analyst may sometimes appear as the absolutely indispensable deus maxima, or an equally indispensable prop for reality. So far as the patient is concerned, he actually is so. It must be left to the analyst to decide how far he himself is the patient's real problem. As soon as the objective level of the interpretation starts getting monotonous and unproductive, it is time to regard the figure of the analyst as a symbol of projected contents that belong to the patient. If the analyst does not do that, he has only two alternatives. Either he can devalue and consequently destroy the transference by reducing it to infantile wishes, or he can accept its reality and sacrifice himself for the patient, which sometimes in the teeth of the latter's unconscious resistance. This is to the advantage of neither party, and the analyst invariably comes off worse. But if it is possible to shift the figure of the analyst onto the subjective level, all the projected contents can be restored to the patient with their original value. An example of the withdrawal of projections can be found in my two essays on analytical psychology. It is clear to me that anyone who is not a practicing analyst herself will see no particular point in discussing the relative merits of the subjective level and the objective level. But the more deeply we penetrate into the problem of dreams, the more the technical aspects of practical treatments have to be taken into account. In this regard, necessity is indeed the mother of invention, for the analyst must constantly strive to develop her techniques in such a way that they can be of help even in the most difficult of cases. We owe it to the difficulties presented by the daily treatment of the sick that we are driven to formulate views which shake the foundations of our everyday beliefs. Although it is a truism to say that an imago is subjective, This statement, nevertheless, has a somewhat philosophical ring that sounds unpleasant to certain ears. Why this should be so is immediately apparent from what was said above, that the naive mind at once identifies the imago with the object. Anything that disturbs this assumption has the irritating effect on this class of people. The idea of a subjective level is equally repugnant to them because it disturbs the naive assumption that the conscious contents are identical with the objects. As events in wartime have clearly shown, our mentality is distinguished by the shameless naivete with which we judge our enemy, and the judgment we pronounce upon him we unwittingly reveal our own defects. We simply accuse our enemy of our own unadmitted faults. We see everything in the other, we criticize and condemn the other. We may even want to improve and educate the other. There is no need for me to adduce case material to prove this proposition. The most convincing proof can be found in every newspaper. But it is quite obvious that what happens on a large scale can also happen on a small scale in the individual. Our mentality is still so primitive that only certain functions and areas have outgrown the primary mystic identity with the object. Primitive man has a minimum of self-awareness combined with a maximum attachment to the object. Hence the object can exercise a direct magical compulsion upon him. All primitive magic and religion are based on these magical attachments, which simply consist in the projection of unconscious contents into the object. Self-awareness gradually developed out of this initial state of identity and went hand in hand with the differentiation of subject and object. This differentiation was followed by the realization that certain qualities which formerly were naively attributed to the object are in reality subjective contents. Although the men of antiquity no longer believed that they were red cockatoos or brothers of the crocodile, they are still enveloped in magical fantasies. In this respect, it was not until the Age of Enlightenment that any essential advance was made. But as everyone knows, our self-awareness is still a long way behind our actual knowledge. When we allow ourselves to be irritated out of our wits by something, let us not assume that the cause of our irritation lies simply and solely outside us, in the irritating thing or person. In that way we endow them with the power to put us into the state of irritation, and possibly even one of insomnia or indigestion. We then turn around and unhesitatingly condemn the object of offense, while all the time we are raging against an unconscious part of ourselves, which is projected into the exasperating object. Such projections are legion. Some of them are favorable, such as bridges for easing off the libido. Some of them are unfavorable, but in practice they are never regarded as obstacles because of the unfavorable projections usually settle outside of our circle of intimate relationships. To this, the neurotic is an exception. Consciously or unconsciously, she has such an intensive relationship to her immediate surroundings that she cannot prevent even the unfavorable projections from flowing onto the objects closest to her and arousing conflicts. She is therefore compelled, if she wants to be cured, to gain insight into her primitive projections to a far higher degree than the normal person does. It is true that the normal person makes the same projections, but they are better distributed. For the favorable ones, the object is close to hand. For the unfavorable ones, it is at a distance. It is the same for the primitive. Anything strange is hostile and evil. This line of division serves a purpose, which is why the normal person feels under no obligation to make these projections conscious, although they are dangerously illusionary. War psychology has made this abundantly clear. Everything my country does is good. Everything the other country does is bad. The center of all iniquity is invariably found to lie a few miles behind the enemy lines. Because the individual has the same primitive psychology, every attempt to bring these age-old projections to consciousness is felt as irritating. Naturally, one would like to have better relations with one's fellows, but only on the conditions that they live up to our expectations. In other words, that they become willing carriers of our projections. Yet, if we make ourselves conscious of these projections, it may easily act as an impediment to our relations with others. and there is no bridge of illusion across which love and hate can stream off so relievingly, and no way of disposing so simply and satisfactory all of those alleged virtues that are intended to edify and improve others. In consequence of this obstruction, there is a damming up of libido, as a result of which the negative projections become increasingly conscious. The individual is then faced with the task of putting down to his own account all the iniquity, devilry, etc., which he has blandly attributed to others, and about which he has been indignant all his life. The irritating thing about this procedure is the conviction on the one hand that if everybody acted in this way life would be so much more endurable, and a violent resistance on the other hand against applying this principle seriously to oneself. If everybody did it, how much better the world would be. But to do it oneself, how intolerable! The neurotic is forced by his neuroses to take this step, but the normal person is not. Instead, he acts out his psychic disturbances socially and politically in the form of mass psychosis like wars and revolutions. The real existence of an enemy upon whom one can foist off everything evil is an enormous relief to one's conscience. You can then at least say without hesitation who the devil is. You are quite certain that the cause of your misfortune is outside and not in your own attitude. Once you have accepted the somewhat disagreeable consequence of interpretation on the subjective level, however, the misgivings force itself onto you that it is surely impossible that all bad qualities which irritate you in others should belong to you. By that token, the great moralist, the financial educationalist, and the world improver would be the worst of all. Much could be said about the close proximity of good and evil, and even more about the direct relations between pairs of opposites, but that would lead us too far from our theme. The interpretation on the subjective level should not, of course, be carried to extremes. It is simply a question of a rather more critical examination of what is permanent and what is not, of what is pertinent and what is not. Something that strikes me about the object may well be a real property of that object, but the more subjective and emotional this impression is, the more likely it is that the property will be a projection. Yet here we must make a not unimportant distinction between the quality actually present in the object, without which a projection could not take place, and the value, significance, or energy of this quality. It is not impossible for a quality to be projected upon the object, of which the object shows barely any trace in reality. For instance, the primitive projection of magical qualities onto inanimate objects. But it is different when the ordinary projection of traits or character are momentary attitudes. Here it frequently happens that the object offers a hook to the projection and even lures it out. This is generally the case when the object herself or himself is not conscious of the quality in question. In that way it works directly upon the unconscious of the projecient. For all projections provoke counter-projections. When the object is unconscious of the quality projected upon it by the subjective, in the same way the transference is answered by counter-transference from the analyst when it projects a content of which she is unconscious but nevertheless exists in her. The counter-transference is then just as useful and meaningful, or as much as of a hindrance, as the transference of a patient, according to whether or not it seeks to establish that better report which is essential for the realization of certain unconscious contents. Like the transference, the countertransference is compulsive, a forcible tie, because it creates a mystical or unconscious identity with the object. Against those unconscious ties there is always resistance, conscious resistance if the subject's attitude allows her to give her libido only voluntarily, give to her libido only voluntarily, but not to have it coaxed or forced out of her, unconscious resistance if she likes nothing better than having her libido taken away from her. Thus, transference and countertransference, if their contents remain unconscious, create abnormal and untenable relationships which aim at their own destruction. But even supposing some trace of the projected quality can be found in the object, the projection still has a purely subjective nature in practice and recoils upon the subject, because it gives an exaggerated value to whatever trace of that quality was present in the object. When the projection corresponds to a quality actually presented in the object, the projected content is nevertheless present in the subject too, where it forms a part of the object imago. The object imago itself is a psychological entity that is distinct from the actual perception of the object. It is an image existing independently of and yet based on all perception, and the relative autonomy of this image remains unconscious so long as it coincides with the actual behavior of the object. The autonomy of the imago is therefore not recognized by the conscious mind, and is unconsciously projected on the object. In other words, it is contaminated with autonomy of the object. This normally endows the object with a compelling reality in relation to the subject and gives it an exaggerated value. This value springs from the projection of the imago on the object, from its a priori identity with it, with the result that the outer object becomes at the same time the inner one. In this way, the outer object can exert, via the unconscious, a direct physic influence on the subject, since by virtue of its identity with the imago, it has to speak. It has it 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 had so to speak a direct hand in the psychic mechanisms of the subject. Consequently, the object can gain magical powers over the subject. Excellent examples of this can be found among primitives who treat their children or any other object as souls, exactly as they treat their own psyches. They dare not do anything to them for fear of offending the soul of the child or object. This is why the children are given as little education as possible until the age of puberty, when suddenly a belated education is thrust upon them, often a rather gruesome one, initiation. Every advance, every conceptual achievement of mankind has been connected with the advance in self-awareness. Man differentiated himself from the object and faced nature as something distinct from her. Any reorientation of psychological attitude will have to follow the same road. It is evident that the identity of the object with the subjective imago gives it significance which does not properly belong to it, but which it has possessed from time immemorial. This identity is the original state of things. For the subject, however, it is a primitive condition which can last only so long as it does not lead to serious inconvenience. Overvaluation of the object is one of the things most liable to prejudice the development of the subject. An over-accentuated magical object orients the subject's consciousness in the direction of the object, and thwarts any attempted individual differentiation, which would obviously have to set in with the detachment of the imago from the object. The direction of his individual differentiation cannot possibly be maintained if external factors magically interfere with the psychic mechanism. The detachment of the imagos that give the object their exaggerated significance restores to the subjective that split-off energy which he urgently needs for his own development. To interpret the dream imagos on the subjective level has therefore the same meaning for modern man as taking away his ancestral figures and fetishes would have for the primitive man, and trying to convince him that his medicine is a spiritual force which dwells not in the object but in the human psyche. The primitive feels a legitimate resistance against this heretical assumption, and in the same way modern man feels that it is disagreeable, perhaps somehow dangerous, to dissolve the time-honored and sacrosanct identity between imago and object. The consequences for our psychology, too, can scarcely be imagined. We would no longer have anybody to rail against, nobody whom we could make responsible, nobody to instruct, improve, and punish. On the contrary, we would have to begin in all things with ourselves. We would have to demand of ourselves and of no one else all the things which we habitually demand of others. That being so, it is understandable while the interpretation of dream imagos on the subjective level is no light step, particularly in as it leads to one-sidedness and exaggeration in one direction or the other. Apart from this purely moral difficulty, there are a number of intellectual obstacles as well. It has often been objected that interpretation on the subjective level is a philosophical problem, and that the application of this principle verges on a Weltanschauung and therefore ceases to be scientific. It does not surprise me that psychology debouches into philosophy, for the thinking that underlies philosophy is after all a psychic activity which, as such, is the proper study of psychology. I always think of psychology as encompassing the world of the psyche, and that includes philosophy and theology and many other things besides. For underlying all philosophies and all religions are the facts of the human soul, which may ultimately be the arbiters of truth and error. It does not matter greatly to our psychology whether problems touch on the one sphere or the other. We have to do first and foremost with practical necessities. If the patient's view of the world becomes a psychological problem, we have to treat it regardless of whether philosophy pertains to psychology or not. Similarly, religious questions are primarily psychological questions so far as we are concerned. It is a regrettable defect that present-day medical psychology should, in general, hold aloof from these problems, and nowhere is this more apparent than in the treatment of the psychogenetic neuroses, which often have a better chance of cure anywhere rather than academic medicine. Although I am a doctor myself, and on the principle that dog does not eat dog, would have every reason not to criticize the medical profession, I must nevertheless confess that doctors are not always the best guardians of the psychiatric art. I have often found that the medical psychologists try to practice their art in the routine manner inculcated into them by the peculiar nature of their studies. The study of medicine consists, on the one hand, in storing up in the mind an enormous number of facts, which are simply memorized without any real knowledge of their foundations, and, on the other hand, learning practical skills, which have to be acquired on the principle, "Don't think, act." Thus, it is said, of all the professions, the medicine man has the least opportunity of developing the function of thinking. It is no wonder that even psychologically trained doctors have the greatest difficulty in following my reflections, if they follow them at all. They have habituated themselves to handing out prescriptions and mechanically applying methods which they have not thought out for themselves. This tendency is the most unsuitable that can be imagined for the practice of medical psychology, for it clings to the skirts of authoritarian theories and techniques, and hinders the development of independent thought. I have found that even elementary distinctions, such as those between subjective level and objective level, ego and self, sign and symbol, causality and finality, which are of the utmost importance in practical treatment, overtax their thinking capacities. This may explain their obstinate adherence to views that are out of date and have long been in need of revision. That this is not merely my own subjective opinion is evident from the fanatical one-sidedness and sectarian exclusiveness of certain psychoanalytical groups. Everyone knows that this attitude is a symbol of overcompensated doubt. But then, who applies psychological criteria to himself? The interpretation of dreams as infantile wish fulfillment or as finalistic arrangements, subserving an infantile striving of power, is much too narrow and fails to do justice to the essential nature of the dream. A dream, like every element in the psychic structure, is a product of the total psyche. Hence, we may expect to find in dreams everything that has ever been of significance in the life of humanity. Just as human life is not limited to this or that fundamental instinct, but builds itself up from a multiplicity of instincts, needs, desires, and psychic and physical conditions, so the dream cannot be explained by this or that element in it, however beguilingly simple such an explanation may appear to be. we can be certain that it is incorrect, because no simple theory of instinct will ever be capable of grasping the human psyche, that mighty and mysterious thing, nor, consequently, its exponent, the dream. In order to do anything like justice to dreams, we need an interpretive equipment that must be laboriously fitted together from all the branches of the humane sciences. Critiques have sometimes accused me outright of philosophical and even theological tendencies, in the belief that I want to explain everything philosophically, and that my psychological views are metaphysical. But I use certain philosophies, religious and historical matter, for the exclusive purpose of illustrating the psychological facts. If, for instance, I make use of a God concept or an equally metaphysical concept of energy, I do so because they are images which have been found in the human psyche from the beginning. I find I must emphasize over and over again that neither the moral order nor the idea of God nor any religion has dropped into man's lap from outside, straight down from heaven, as it were, but that he contains all this in enunciate within himself, and for this reason can produce it all out of himself. It is therefore idle to think that nothing but enlightenment is needed to dispel these phantoms. The ideas of the moral order and of God belonging to the ineradicable substrate of the human soul. This is why any honest psychology, which is not blinded by a garish conceits of enlightenment, must come to terms with these facts. They cannot be explained away and killed with irony. In physics, we can do without a God image, but in psychology it is a definite fact that has got to be reckoned with, just as we have to reckon with affect, instinct, mother, etc. It is the fault of the everlasting condemnation of object and imago that people can make no conceptual distinction between God and God image, and therefore think that when one speaks of the God image, one is speaking of God and offering theological explanations. It is not for psychology as a science to demand a hypnosanitization of the God image. But the facts being what they are, it does have to reckon with the existence of the God image. In the same way it reckons with instinct, but does not deem itself competent to say what instinct really is. The psychological factor thereby denoted is clear to everyone, just as it is far from clear what that factor is in and of itself. It is equally clear that the God image corresponds to a definite complex of psychological facts, and is thus a quantity which we can operate with, but that God is in himself remains a question outside the competence of all psychology. I regret having to repeat such elementary truths. Herewith I have said pretty well all I have to say about the general aspects of dream psychology. I have purposefully refrained from going into details. This must be reserved for studies of case material. Our discussion of the general aspects has led us to wider problems that are unavoidable in speaking of dreams. Naturally, very much more could be said about the aims of dream analysis, but since dream analysis is instrumental to analytical treatment in general, this could be done only if I were to embark on the whole question of therapy. But a thoroughgoing description of the therapy would require a number of preliminary studies that tackle the problems from different sides. This question is an exceedingly complex one, despite the fact that certain authors outdo one another in simplifications and try to make us believe that the known roots of the illness can be extracted from the utmost simplicity. I must warn against all such frivolous undertakings. I would rather see serious minds settling down to discuss thoroughly and consciously the great problems which analysis has brought in its train. It is really high time academic psychologists come down to earth and wanted to hear about the human psyche as it really is, and not merely about laboratory experiments. It is insufferable that professors should forbid their students to having anything to do with analytical psychology, that they should prohibit the use of analytical concepts, and accuse our psychology of taking account in an unscientific manner of everyday experiences. I know that psychology in general could derive the greatest benefit from a serious study of the dream problem, once it could rid itself of the unjustified lay prejudice that dreams are caused solely by somatic stimuli. This overreacting by the of the somatic factor in psychiatry is one of the basic reasons why psychopathology has made no advances unless directly fertilized by analytical procedures. The dogma that mental diseases are diseases of the brain is a hangover from the materialism of the 1870s. It has become a prejudice which hinders all progress, with nothing to justify it. Even if it were true that all mental diseases were diseases of the brain, that would still be no reason for not investigating the psychic side of the disease. But the prejudice is used to discredit at the outset all attempts in this direction and to strike them dead. Yet the proof that all mental diseases are diseases of the brain has never yet been furnished, and can never be furnished, any more than it can be proved that man thinks or acts as he does because this or that protein has broken down or formed itself in this or that cell. Such a view leads straight to the materialistic gospel. Man is what he eats. Those who think this in this way conceive our mental life as embolic and catabolic processes in the brain cells. These processes are necessarily thought or merely as laboratory processes of synthesis and disintegration, for to think of them as living processes is totally impossible, so long as we cannot think in terms of the life process itself. But that is how we would have to think of the cell process if validity were to be claimed for the materialistic view. In that case we would already have passed beyond materialism, for life can never be thought of as a functioning of matter, but only as a process existing in and for itself, to which energy and matter are subordinate. Life as a function of matter postulates spontaneous generation, and for proof of that we shall have to wait a long time. We have no more justification for understanding the psyche as a brain process than we have for understanding life in general from a one-sided, arbitrarily materialistic point of view that can never be proved, quite apart from the fact that the very attempt to imagine such a thing is crazy in itself, and has always engendered craziness whenever it was taken seriously. We have, on the contrary, to consider the psychic process as psychic and not as organic cell process. However, indignant people may get about physical phantoms when cell processes are explained vitalistically, they nevertheless continue to regard the physical hypothesis as scientific, although it is no less fantastic. But it fits in with the materialistic prejudice, and therefore every bit of nonsense, provided only that it turns the psyche into the physical, becomes scientifically sacrosanct. Let us hope that time is not far off when this antiquated relic of ingrained and thoughtless materialism will be eradicated from the minds of our scientists. On the nature of dreams. Medical psychology differs from all our scientific disciplines in that it has to deal with the most complex problems without being able to rely on tested rules of procedure, on a series of verifiable experiments and logically explicatable facts. On the contrary, it is confronted with a mass of shifting, irrational happenings, for the psyche is perhaps the most baffling and unapproachable phenomenon with which the scientific mind has ever had to deal. Although we must assume that all psychic phenomena are somehow, in the broadest sense, causally dependent, it is advisable to remember at this point that causality is in the last analysis no more than a statistical truth. Therefore, we should perhaps do well in certain cases to make allowances for absolute irrationality, even if, on heuristic grounds, we approach each particular case by inquiring into its causality. Even then, it is advisable to bear in mind at least one of the classical distinctions, namely that between causal efficiens and causal finalis. In psychological matters, the question, why does it happen, is not necessarily more productive of results than the other question, to what purpose does it happen? Among the many puzzles of medical psychology, there is one problem child, the dream. It would be an interesting as well as difficult task to examine the dream exclusively in its medical aspects. That is, with regard to the diagnosis and prognosis of pathological conditions. The dream does in fact concern itself with both health and sickness, and since by virtue of its source and the unconscious it draws upon a wealth of subliminal perceptions, it can sometimes produce things that are very well worth knowing. This has often proved helpful to me in cases where the differential diagnosis between organic and psychogenic symptoms present difficulties. For prognosis, too, certain dreams are important. In this field, however, the necessary preliminary studies, such as careful records of case histories and the likes, are still lacking. Doctors with psychological training do not as yet make a practice of recording dreams systematically, so as to preserve material which have a bearing on the subsequent outbreak of severe illness or a lethal issue. In other words, on events which could not be foreseen at the beginning of the record. The investigation of dreams in general is a life work in itself, and their detailed study requires the cooperation of many workers. I have therefore preferred in this short review to deal with the fundamental aspects of dream psychology and interpretation in such a way that those who have no experience in this field can at least get some idea of the problem and the method of inquiry. Anyone who is familiar with the material will probably agree with me that a knowledge of fundamentals is more important than an accumulation of case histories, which still cannot make up for the lack of experience. The dream is a fragment of involuntary psychic activity, just conscious enough to be reproducible in the waking state. Of all psychic phenomena, the dream presents perhaps the largest number of irrational factors. It seems to possess a minimum of the logical coherence and the hierarchy of values shown by the other contents of the consciousness, and is therefore less transparent and understandable. Dreams that form logically, morally, or aesthetically satisfying wholes are exceptional. Usually a dream is a strange and disconcerting product, distinguished by many bad qualities, such as lack of logic, questionable morality, uncouth form, and apparent absurdity or nonsense. People are therefore only too glad to dismiss it as stupid, meaningless, and worthless. Every interpretation of a dream is a psychological statement about certain of its contents. This is not without danger, as the dreamer, like most people, usually displays an astonishing sensitiveness to critical remarks, not only if they are wrong, but even more if they are right. Since it is not possible, except under very special conditions, to work out the meaning of the dream without the collaboration of the dreamer, an extraordinary amount of tact is required not to violate her self-respect unnecessarily. For instance, if one is to say when a patient tells a number of indecent dreams and then asks, "Why should I have such disgusting dreams?" To this sort of question it is better to give no answer, since an answer is difficult for several reasons, especially for the beginner, and one who is very apt under such circumstances to say something clumsy, above all when one thinks one knows what the answer is. So difficult is it to understand a dream that for a long time I have made it a rule, when someone tells me a dream and asks my opinion, to say first of all to myself, "I have no idea what this dream means." After that I can begin to examine the dream. Here the reader will certainly ask, is it worthwhile in any individual case to look at the meaning of the dream, supposing that dreams have any meaning at all, and that this meaning can be proved? It is easy to prove that an animal is an invertebrate by laying bare its spine. But how does one proceed to lay bare the inner, meaningful structure of a dream? Apparently the dream follows no clearly determining law or regular modes of behavior apart from the well-known typical dreams, such as nightmares. Anxiety dreams are not unusual, but they are by no means the rule. Also, there are typical dream motifs known to the layman, such as flying, climbing stairs or mountains, going about with insufficient clothing, losing your teeth, crowds of people, hotels, railway stations, trains, aeroplanes, automobiles, frightening animals like snakes. These motifs are very common, but by no means sufficient to confirm the existence of any system in the organization of a dream. Some people have recurrent dreams. This happens particularly in use, but the reoccurrence may continue over several decades. These are often very impressive dreams, which convince one that they must surely have a meaning. This feeling is justified insofar as one cannot, even taking the most cautious view, avoid the assumption that a definite psychic situation does arise from time to time which causes the dream. But a psychic situation is something that, if it can be formulated, is identical with a definite meaning, provided, of course, that one does not stubbornly hold to the hypothesis, certainly not proven, that all dreams can be tracked back to stomach trouble or sleeping on one's back or the like. Such dreams do, indeed, tempt one to conjure up some kind of cause. The same is true of so-called typical motifs, which repeat themselves frequently in longer series of dreams. Here again, it is hard to escape the impression that they mean something. But how do we arrive at a plausible meaning, and how can we confirm the rightness of the interpretation? One method, which however is not scientific, would be to predict future happenings from the dreams by means of a dream book, and to verify the interpretation by subsequent events, assuming of course that the meaning of dreams lies in their anticipation in the future. Another way is to get at the meaning of the dream directly, might be to turn to the past and reconstruct former experiences from the occurrence of certain motifs in the dream. While this is possible to a limited extent, it would have a decisive value only if we could discover in this way something which, although it had actually taken place, had remained unconscious to the dreamer, or at any rate something she would not like to divulge under any circumstances. If neither is the case, then we are dealing simply with memory images, whose appearance in the dream is a. not denied by anyone, and b. completely irrelevant as far as meaningful dream function is concerned, since the dreamer could just as well have supplied the information consciously. This unfortunately exhausts the possible ways of proving the meaning of dreams directly. It is Freud's great achievement to have put dream interpretation on the right track. Above all, he recognized that no interpretation can be undertaken without the dreamer. The words composing the dream narrative have not just one meaning, but many meanings. If, for instance, someone dreams of a table, we are still far from knowing what the table of the dreamer signifies, although the word table sounds unambiguous enough. For the thing we do not know is that the table is the very one at which his father sat when he refused the dreamer all future financial help, and threw him out of the house as a good-for-nothing. The polished surface of this table stares at him as a symbol of his lamentable worthlessness in his daytime consciousness as well as in his dreams at night. This is what our dreamer understands by table. Therefore, we need the dreamer's help in order to limit the multiple meanings of the word to which these are essential and convincing. That the table stands as a mortifying landmark in the dreamer's life may be doubted by anyone who is not present, but the dreamer does not doubt it, nor do I. Clearly, dream interpretation is in the first place an experience that has immediate validity for only two persons. If, therefore, we establish that the table in the dream means just that fatal table, with all that it implies, then, although we have not explained the dream, we have at least interpreted one important motif in it. That is, we have recognized the subjective content to which the word table is embedded. We arrived at this conclusion by methodological questioning of the dreamer's own association. The further procedures to which Freud subjects the dream contents I have to reject, for they are too much influenced by the preconceived opinion that dreams are the fulfillment of repressed wishes. Although there are such dreams, this is far from proving that all dreams are wish fulfillments, any more than are the thoughts of our psychic life. There is no ground for the assumption that the unconscious process underlying the dream are more limited and one-sided in form and content than the conscious process. One would rather expect that the latter could be limited to known categories, since they usually reflect the regulatory and even monotony of the conscious way of life. On the basis of these conclusions, and for the purpose of ascertaining the meaning of the dream, I have developed a procedure which I call taking up the context. This consists in making sure that every shade of meaning with each salient feature of the dream has for the dreamer is determined by the associations of the dreamer herself. I therefore proceed in the same way as I would in deciphering a difficult text. This method does not always produce an immediately understandable result. Often the only thing that emerges at first is a hint that looks significant. To give an example, I was working with a young man who mentioned in his amnesis that he was happily engaged and to a girl of a good family. In his dreams, she frequently appeared in very unflattering guise. The context showed that the dreamer's unconscious connected the figure of his bride with all kinds of scandalous stories from quite another source, which was incomprehensible to him and naturally also to me. But from the constant repetition of such combinations, I had to conclude that, despite his conscious resistance, there existed in him an unconscious tendency to show his bride in this ambiguous light. He told me that if such a thing were true, it would be a catastrophe. His acute neurosis had set in a short time after his engagement. Although it was something he could not bear to think about, this suspicion of his bride seemed to me a point of capital importance that I advised him to investigate with some inquiries. These showed the suspicion to be well founded, and the shock of the unpleasant discovery did not kill the patient, but was, on the contrary, cured him of his neurosis and also of his bride. Thus, although the taking up of the context resulted in an unthinkable meaning, and hence in an apparently nonsensical interpretation, it proved correct in the light of facts which were subsequently disclosed. This case is of an exemplary simplicity, and it is superfluous to point out that only rarely do dreams have so simple a solution. The examination of the content is, to be sure, a simple, almost mechanical piece of work, which has only a preparatory significance. But the subsequent production of a readable text, i.e., the actual interpretation of the dream, is, as a rule, a very exacting task. It needs psychological empathy, ability to coordinate, intuition, knowledge of the world and of men, and above all, special canniness, which depends on wide understanding as well as on certain intelligence du cœur, intelligence of the heart. All these presumed qualifications, including even the last, are valuable for the art of medical diagnosis in general. No sixth sense is needed to understand dreams. But more is required than routine recipes such as are found in vulgar little dream books, or which invariably develop under the influence of preconceived notions. Stereotyped interpretation of dream motifs is to be avoided. The only justifiable interpretations are those reached through a painstaking examination of the context. Even if one has great experience in these matters, one is again and again obliged, before each dream, to admit one's ignorance, and, renouncing all preconceived ideas, to prepare for something entirely unexpected. Even though dreams refer to a definite attitude of consciousness and a definite psychic situation, their roots lie deep in the unfathomably dark recesses of the conscious mind. For want of a more descriptive term, we call this unknown background the unconscious. We do not know its nature in and for itself, but we observe certain effects from those qualities. We venture certain conscious conclusions in regard to the nature of the unconscious psyche. Because dreams are the most common and most normal expression of the unconscious psyche, they provide the bulk of the material for its investigation. Since the meaning of dreams is not in accord with the tendencies of the conscious mind, but shows peculiar deviations, we must assume that the unconscious, the matrix of dreams, has an independent function. This is what I call the autonomy of the unconscious. The dream not only fails to obey our will, but very often stands in flagrant opposition to our conscious intention. The opposition need not always be so marked. Sometimes the dream deviates only a little from the conscious attitude and introduces only slight modifications. Occasionally it may even coincide with conscious content and tendencies. When I attempted to express this behavior in a formula, the concept of compensation seemed to me the only adequate one, for it alone is capable of summing up all the various ways in which a dream behaves. Compensation must be strictly distinguished from complementation. The concept of a complement is too narrow and too restricting. It does not suffice to explain the function of dreams, because it designates a relationship in which two things supplement each other more or less mechanically. Compensation, on the other hand, as the term implies, means balancing and comparing different data or points of view so as to produce an adjustment or a rectification. In this regard, there are three possibilities. If the conscious attitude to the life situation is in a large degree one-sided, then the dream takes the opposite side. If the conscious has a position fairly near the middle, the dream is satisfied with variations. If the conscious attitude is correct, adequate, then the dream coincides with this and emphasizes this tendency, though without forfeiting its peculiar autonomy. As one never knows with certainty how to evaluate the conscious situation of a patient, dream interpretation is naturally impossible without questioning the dreamer. But even if we know the conscious situation, we know nothing of the attitude of the unconscious. As the unconscious is the matrix not only of dreams but also of psychogenic symptoms, the question of the attitude of the unconscious is of great practical importance. The unconscious, not caring whether I and those about me feel my attitude to be right, may, so to speak, be of another mind. This especially is in the case of neurosis. It is not a matter of indifference, as the unconscious is quite capable of bringing about all kinds of unwelcome disturbances by mistake, often with serious consequences, or of provoking neurotic symptoms. These disturbances are due to a lack of harmony between conscious and unconscious. Normally, as we say, such harmony would be present. The fact is, however, that very frequently it is simply not there, and this is the reason for the vast number of psychogenic misfortunes ranging from severe accidents and illness to harmless slips of the tongue. We owe our knowledge of these relationships to the work of Freud. Although in the great majority of cases compensation aims at establishing a normal psychological balance, and thus appears as a kind of self-regulation of the psychic system, one must not forget that under certain circumstances and in certain cases, for instance in latent psychoses, compensation may lead to a fatal outcome owing to the preponderance of destructive tendencies. The result is suicide or some other abnormal action apparently preordained in the life pattern of certain hereditary tainted individuals. In the treatment of neurosis, the task before us is to re-establish an approximate harmony between conscious and unconscious. That is, as we know, can be achieved in a variety of ways, from living a natural life, persuasive reasoning, strengthening the will, the analysis of the unconscious. Because the simpler methods so often fail, and the doctor does not know how to go on treating the patient, the compensatory function of dreams often offers welcome assistance. I do not mean that the dreams of modern people indicate appropriate methods of healing, as was reported by the incubation dreams dreamt in the temples of Asclepius. They do, however, eliminate the patient's situation in a way that can be exceedingly beneficial to health. They bring him memories, insights, experiences, awaken dormant qualities in the personality, and reveal the unconscious element in his relationships. So it seldom happens that anyone who has taken the trouble to work over his dreams with qualified assistance for a longer period of time remains without enrichment and a broadening of his mental horizons. Just because of their compensatory behavior, a methodological analysis of dreams discloses new points of view and new ways of getting over dreaded impasses. The term compensation naturally gives us only a very general idea of the function of dreams. But if, as happens in long and difficult treatments, the analyst observes a series of dreams often running into hundreds, there gradually forces itself upon him a phenomenon which, in an isolated dream, would remain hidden behind the compensation of the moment. This phenomenon is a kind of developmental process in the personality itself. At first it seems that each compensation is a momentary adjustment of one-sidedness, or an equalization of disturbed balance. But with deeper insight and experience, these apparent separate acts of compensation arrange themselves into a kind of plan. They seem to hang together in the deepest sense of the subordinated to a common goal, so that the long dream series no longer appears as a senseless string of incoherent and isolated happenings, but resembles the successive steps in a planned and orderly process of development. I have called this unconscious process spontaneously expressing itself, the symbolicism of a long dream series, the individuation process. Here, more than anywhere else in the discussion of dream psychology, illustrative examples would be desired. Unfortunately, this is quite impossible for technical reasons. I must therefore refer the reader to my book Psychology and Alchemy, which contains an investigation into the structure of a dream series with special references to the individuation process. The question whether a long series of dreams recorded outside the analytical procedure would likewise reveal a development aiming at individuation is one that cannot be answered at present for lack of necessary material. The analytical procedure, especially when it includes a systematic dream analysis, is a process of quickened maturation, as Stanley Hall once aptly remarked. It is therefore possible that the motifs accompanying the individuation process appear chiefly and predominantly in dream series recorded under analysis, whereas in extra-analytical dream series they occur only at much greater intervals of time. I have mentioned before that dream interpretation requires, among other things, specialized knowledge. While I am quite ready to believe that any intelligent layman with some psychological knowledge and experience of life could, with practice, diagnose dream compensation correctly, I consider impossible for anyone without knowledge of mythology and folklore, and without some understanding of the psychology of primitives and of comparative religion, to grasp the essence of the individuation process, which, according to all we know, lies at the base of psychological compensation. Not all dreams are of equal importance. Even primitives distinguish between big and little dreams, as we might say insignificant and significant dreams. Looked at more closely, little dreams are the nightly fragments of fantasy coming from the subjective and personal sphere. Their meaning is limited to the affairs of every day. This is why such dreams are easily forgotten, just because their validity is restricted to the day-to-day fluctuations of the psychic balance. Significant dreams, on the other hand, are often remembered for a lifetime, and not infrequently prove to be the richest jewel in the treasure house of the psychic experience. How many people have I encountered who at their first meeting could not refrain from saying, "I once had a dream"? Sometimes it was the first dream they could ever remember, and one that occurred between the ages of 3 and 5. I have examined many such dreams, and often found in them a peculiarity which distinguishes them from other dreams. They contain symbolic images which we also come across in the mental history of mankind. It is worth noting that the dreamer does not need to have any inkling of the existence of such parallels. This particularity is characteristic of dreams of the individuation process, where we find the mythological motifs, or mythogems, I have distinguished as archetypes. These are to be understood as specific forms and groups of images, which occur not only at all times and in all places, but also in individual dreams, fantasies, visions, and delusional ideas. Their frequent appearance in individual case material, as well as their universal distribution, prove that the human psyche is unique and subjective or personal only in part, for the rest is collective and objective. Thus we speak on the one hand of a personal and on the other hand of a collective unconscious, which lies at a deeper level and is further removed from the consciousness than the personal unconscious. The big or meaningful dreams come from this deeper level. They reveal their significance, quite apart from the subjective impression they make, by their plastic form, which often has a poetic force and beauty. Such dreams occur mostly during the critical phases of life, in early youth, puberty, at the onset of middle age, 36 to 40, and within sight of death. Their interpretation often invokes considerable difficulties, because the material which the dreamer is able to contribute is too meager. For these archetypical products are no longer concerned with personal experiences, but with the general ideas, whose chief significance lies in their intrinsic meaning, and not in any personal experience and its association. For example, a young man dreamed of a great snake that guarded a golden bowl in an underground vault. To be sure, he had once seen a huge snake in a zoo, but otherwise he could suggest nothing that might have prompted such a dream, except perhaps a reminiscence of fairy tales. Judging by this unsatisfactory context of the dream, which actually produced a very powerful effect, would have had hardly any meaning. But that would not explain its decided emotionality. In such a case, we have to go back to mythology, where the combination of a snake or dragon with treasure and cave represents an ordeal in the life of the hero. Then it becomes clear that we are dealing with a collective emotion, a typical situation full of affect, which is not primarily a personal experience, but becomes one only secondarily. Primarily, it is a universally human problem which, because it has been overlooked subjectively, forces itself objectively upon the dreamer's consciousness. A man in middle life still feels young, and age and death lie far ahead of him. At about 36, he passes the zenith of his life without being conscious of the meaning of this fact. If he is a man whose whole make-up and nature do not tolerate excessive unconsciousness, then the import of this moment will be forced upon him, perhaps in the form of an archetypal dream. It would be in vain for him to try to understand the dream with the help of a carefully worked out context, for it expresses itself in strange mythological forms that are not familiar to him. The dream uses collective figures because it has to express an eternal human problem that repeats itself endlessly, and not just a disturbance of personal balance. All these moments in the individual's life, when the universal laws of human fate break in upon the purposes, expectations, and opinions of the personal consciousness, are stations along the road of the individuation process. This process is, in effect, the spontaneous realization of the whole man. The ego consciousness personality is only a part of the whole man, and its life does not yet represent his total life. The more he is merely I, the more he splits himself off from the collective man, of whom he is also a part, and may even find himself in opposition to him. But since everything living strives for wholeness, the inevitable one-sidedness of our conscious life is continually being corrected and compensated by the universal human being in us, whose goal is the ultimate integration of conscious and unconscious, or better, the assimilation of the ego to a wider personality. Such reflections are unavoidable if one wants to understand the meaning of big dreams. They employ numerous mythological motifs that characterize the life of the hero, of the greater man who is the semi-divine by nature. Here we find the dangerous adventures and ordeals such as occur in initiations. We meet dragons, helpful animals, and demons, also the wise old man, the animal man, the wishing tree, the hidden treasure, and as well the cave, the walled garden, the transformative processes, and the substances of alchemy, and so forth, all things which in no way touch the banalities of every day. The reason for this is that they do not have to do with the realization of a part of the personality which has yet to come into existence, but it is still in the process of becoming. How such mythologems get condensed in dreams and how they modify one another is shown in the picture of the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel 4:7 ff. Frontispiece. Although purporting to be no more than a representation of that dream, it has, so to speak, been dreamed over and over again by the artist, as is immediately apparent if one examines the details more closely. The tree is growing, in a quite unbiblical manner, out of the king's navel. It is therefore the genealogical tree of Christ's ancestors that grows from the navel of Adam, the tribal father. For this reason it bears its branches, and the pelican, who nourishes its young with its blood, a well-known allegory of Christ. Apart from that pelican, together with the four birds that take the place of the four symbols of the evangelists, they form a quincunx. This quincunx reappears lower down in a stag, another symbol of Christ, with the four animals looking expectantly upwards. These two quaternities have the closest connection with alchemical ideas. Above, the volatilia, below the terrana, the former traditionally represented as birds, the latter as quadrupeds. Thus, not only has the Christian conception of the genealogical tree and of the evangelical quaternity insinuated itself into the picture, but also the alchemical idea of double quaternity, superius est sicut quod inferius. This contamination shows in the most vivid way how individual dreams make use of archetypes. The archetypes are condensed, interwoven, and blended not only with one another, as here, but also with unique individual elements. But if dreams produce such essential compensations, why are they not understandable? I have often been asked this question. The answer must be that the dream is a natural occurrence, and that nature shows no inclination to offer her fruits gratis or according to human expectations. It is often objected that the compensation must be ineffective unless the dream is understood. This is not so certain, however, for many things can be effective without being understood. But there is no doubt that we can enhance its effect considerably by understanding the dream, and this is often necessary because the voice of the unconscious so easily goes unheard. What nature leaves imperfect is perfected by the art, says an alchemical dictum. Coming now to the form of dreams, we find everything from lightning impressions to endlessly spurn on the dream narrative. Nevertheless, there are a great many average dreams in which a definite structure can be perceived, not unlike that of a drama. For instance, the dream begins with a statement of place, such as "I was in a street, it was an avenue," or "I was in a large building like a hotel." Next comes a statement about the protagonist. For example, "I was walking with my friend X in a city park. At a crossing, we suddenly ran into Mrs. Y." Or, "I was sitting with father and mother in a train compartment." Or, "I was in uniform with many of my comrades." Statements of time are rarer. I call this phase of the dream the exposition. It indicates the scene of the action, the people involved, and the initial situation of the dreamer. In the second phase comes the development of the plot. For example, "I was in a street, it was an avenue. In the distance a car appeared, which approached rapidly. It was being driven very unsteadily, and I thought the driver must be drunk." Or, "Mrs. Y seemed to be very excited and wanted to whisper something to me hurriedly, which my friend X was obviously not intended to hear." The situation is somehow becoming complicated, and a definite tension develops because one does not know what will happen. The third phase brings accumulation, or peripeteria. Here, something decisive happens, or something changes completely. Suddenly, I was in the car and seemed to be myself this drunken driver. Only I was not drunk, but strangely insecure, and as if without a steering wheel. I could no longer control the fast-moving car, crashed into a wall. Or, suddenly Mrs. Y turned deathly pale and fell to the ground. The fourth and last phase is the lysis, or solution or result, produced by the dream work. There are certain dreams in which the fourth phase is lacking, and this can present a special problem, not to be discussed here. Examples: I saw that the front part of the car was smashed. It was a strange car that I did not know. I myself was unhurt. I thought with some uneasiness of my responsibility. Or, "We thought Miss Y was dead, but it was evidently only a faint." My friend X cried out, "I must fetch a doctor." The last phase shows the final situation, which is at the same time the solution sought by the dreamer. In the dreamer, a new reflectiveness has supervened after a kind of rudderless confusion, or rather should supervene, since the dream is compensatory. The upshot of Dream 3 is the thought that the help of a competent third person is indicated. The first dream was a man who had rather lost his head in difficult family circumstances, and did not want to let matters go to extremes. The other dreamer wondered whether he ought to obtain the help of a psychiatrist for his neuroses. Naturally, these statements are not interpretations of the dream. They merely outline the initial situation. This division into four phases can be applied without much difficulty to the majority of dreams within practice, an indication that dreams generally have a dramatic structure. The essential content of the dream action, as I have shown above, is a sort of finely attuned compensation of the one-sided errors, deviations, and other shortcomings of a conscious attitude. Any hysterical patient of mine, an aristocratic lady, who seemed to herself no end distinguished, met in her dreams a whole series of dirty fishwives and drunken prostitutes. In extreme cases, the compensation becomes so menacing that the fear of its result is sleeplessness. Thus the dream may either repudiate the dreamer in a most painful way, or bolster him up morally. The first is likely to happen to people who, like the last mentioned patient, have too good an opinion of themselves; the second to those whose self-valuation is too low. Occasionally, however, the arrogant person is not simply humiliated in the dream, but is raised to an altogether improbable and absurd eminence, while the all too humble individual is, just as improperly degraded, in order to rub it in, as the English say. Many people who know something but not enough about dreams and their meanings, and who are impressed by their subtle and apparently intentional compensation, are liable to succumb to the prejudice that the dream actually has a moral purpose, that it warns, rebukes, confronts, foretells the future, etc. If one believes that the unconscious always knows what is best, one can easily be betrayed into leaving the dream to take the necessary decisions, and then is disappointed when the dreams become more and more trivial and meaningless. Experience has shown me that a slight knowledge of a dream psychology is apt to lead to an overrating of the unconscious, which impairs the power of conscious decision. The unconscious functions are satisfactory only when the conscious mind fulfills its tasks to the very limit. A dream may perhaps supply what is then lacking, or it may help us forward where our best efforts have failed. If the unconscious really were superior to the conscious, it would be difficult to see wherein the advantages of consciousness lay, or why it should ever come into being as a necessary element in the scheme of evolution. If it were nothing but a lusus naturae, a fact of our conscious, the fact of our conscious awareness of the world and of our own existence would be without meaning. The idea that consciousness is a freak of nature is somehow difficult to digest, and for psychological reasons we should avoid emphasizing it, even if it were correct, which, by the way, we shall luckily never be in a position to prove, any more than we can prove the contrary. It is a question that belongs to the realm of metaphysics, with no criterion of where no criterion of truth exists. However, this is in no way to underestimate the fact that metaphysical views are of the utmost importance for the well-being of the human psyche. In the study of dream psychology, we encounter far-reaching philosophical and even religious problems, to the understanding of which the phenomena of dreams has already made decisive contributions. But we cannot boast that we are at present in possession of a generally satisfying theory or explanation of this complicated phenomenon. We still know far too little about the nature of the unconscious psyche for that. In this field there is still an infinite amount of patient and unprejudiced work to be done, which no one will begrudge. For the purpose of research, it is not to imagine that one possesses the theory which alone is right, but, doubting all theories, to approach gradually nearer to the truth.